Good morning, everyone. So, welcome back to another video discussion that we will be having for today. So, last time, what we had was all about your Beer's Law, and it is very important for you to understand that very well for us to be able to continue on to the next topics that we will be discussing. So, if you haven't watched the video, I'll be putting the link on the description box so that you can go back to it anytime when you are confused about anything regarding the Beer's law. But for today, what we will be discussing is all about your spectrophotometry. Yes, your spectrophotometry. This is the first instrumentation, first analytical technique that we will be discussing for today. So let's dig in. All right. So our discussion for this morning will all be about the introduction to your spectrophotometry. So I'll be discussing very important concepts with regards to energy, to your electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic waves, and your Planck's law. Yes, your Planck's law. Next one, I will be differentiating your spectrophotometer to other photometric principles and instruments. And of course, um, I'll just be going through your Beer's law quickly. Again, I'll be putting the link on the description box so that you can watch the separate video for your Beer's law. And then I'll be cutting this video into two parts. One will be about the introduction in your spectrophotometer, and we will be having a separate video for the different components of your spectrophotometer so that all of you will be having a bite-sized information and learning for today. So are you guys ready? So let's dig in. So for the introduction, this is a picture of the spectrophotometer that we actually have in the laboratory. So if you're asking, sir, do we really use that in the practice? Yes and no. Okay? Yes and no. For some laboratories, they are actually still using this type of spectrophotometer. This type of spectrophotometer is a semi-automated because you still have to be the one to put the specimen, to do the blanking, unlike the fully automated spectrophotometer that we also have in the laboratory. So, technically, even if those are different when it comes to automation, one is semi-automated, the other is fully automated, still, all are the same. They are still using your spectrophotometer and they are still under the principle of your spectrophotometry. And this is the very reason why we are studying this. Because for most of you, when you go to the laboratory and work, you won't be able to see a semi-automated spectrophotometer anymore. Okay, so this is the reason why we have to discuss the principle and even the different components of your spectrophotometer. Again, why? Because in the actual scenario, what you're going to see is already a spectrophotometer built inside your automated machine. Okay, so let's move on. So what we have now is your spectrophotometer, and your spectrophotometer is actually an example of an optical instrument. When I say optical instrument, it is used to measure your light. Yes, it is used to measure your light. Similar to what we were discussing when we discuss your Beer's law, isn't it that when computing or measuring the concentration of your analytes, take for example your glucose, your cholesterol, or even your triglycerides or whatever analytes you want to measure, what we are actually using is your light. So you um introduce light to your sample and then you compute your absorbance by technically computing your percent transmittant. So your spectrophotometer, to be exact, measures your electromagnetic radiation. And what is an electromagnetic radiation? It is described as photons of energy traveling in waves. And we call those waves as your electromagnetic waves. It is very important for us to understand electromagnetic radiation and eventually your electromagnetic waves because Similarly to what we were discussing in your Beer's law, we will be introducing your light. Okay, we will be introducing your light or your light energy. Technically, that is your photons. So technically, we will be measuring the light that is being transmitted from your your solution to indirectly measure your absorbance. So when we are talking about your electromagnetic radiation, we are talking about your magnetic waves. So if you still remember frequency, wavelength, yes, that's it. So electromagnetic waves can be described by their wavelength and frequency. So bear with me now because it is very important as we go to your spectrophotometer later. I'll explain to you why do we need to study wavelengths and frequency. Okay? Wavelengths and frequency. So, according to Planck's law, it states that the relationship between your wavelength and energy are inversely proportional. Okay? Inversely proportional. So, as you can see on your left, that is the formula for your Planck's law. Your energy, signified by your E, is equal to your Planck's constant, which is your H, times your frequency. Okay? Times your frequency. So, sir, what about wavelength and frequency that we need to talk about this? Because later on, when we go deeper to your spectrophotometry, you would realize now that we are not just measuring your white light or your light itself. We are measuring a specific wavelength, a specific light coming now from the spectrum of your light. The reason why we call it your spectrophotometer. So, frequency and wavelength. Let me differentiate the two for you first. So we have your frequency. So frequency is the number of vibration of waves motion per second. So technically, your frequency is equal to your energy. The higher the energy, the higher the more vibrations there are, or the higher the frequency is. So on the other hand, what is wavelength? Wavelength now is the distance between two peaks of your frequency. So technically, so um I'll show you a picture so that you would understand it better. So on the upper part, you would see there, it is an example of a high frequency energy. So having said that, that high frequency is also of high energy. Unlike the one below, this is low frequency because there are only how you can simply count the the peaks. We only have 1 and 2. Unlike this one, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. So, what specifically is your wavelength? Your wavelength is the distance from this point to this point. So, that in itself is your wavelength. That is the distance between your two peaks. So, like this one, I want you to realize that the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. Okay? The higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. Why? Kasi nga, mas madami yung vibration, mas dikit-dikit sila. So, ibig sabihin, shorter yung wavelength. Unlike if you have a low frequency energy, the wavelength is longer. Why? Again, because konti lang yung vibration, malayo yung isa from the other. Okay? Parang imagine nyo, if you're forming a line and there is no space between you and the person in front of you and the person at your back, that in itself is an example of a short wavelength. Unlike kunwari ngayon, what we're having right now is your community quarantine. What we have now is actually a 1 meter distance from one another. So that is actually causing a bigger or a longer wavelength or a longer distance. Okay? So frequency and wavelength. So having said that now, as we go on now, so to your and your frequency and your wavelength, we go now to your electromagnetic spectrum. And when I say electromagnetic spectrum, it's in it, the light that you are seeing, the visible light that you are seeing, appears to be only white. But if you're gonna dissect that light, or if you're gonna look deeper into the spectrum of that light, you would actually realize that it is not just color white. Okay? It's not just colored white. So what I have in front of you is actually the electromagnetic spectrum or the light spectrum. What we usually see are your visible spectrum, okay? Your visible spectrum. And the usual wavelength, okay? The usual wavelength of your visible spectrum is from 400 to 700 nanometer. So remember that, okay? If the wavelength is 400 to 700 nanometer, that is your visible light or your visible spectrum. On the other hand, if it is less than 400, we call now that your ultraviolet region. Okay? And if it is greater than 700 nanometer, that is now your infrared region. So I intentionally made the visible spectrum as your yellow, because usually that is the color of your light. It can either be yellow or white. So technically that is your visible spectrum or your visible light, again 400 to 700 nanometer. And then we also have your ultraviolet light. That is the wavelength of your ultraviolet region is from 399 below, so less than 400 nanometer. And for your infrared region, we have greater than 700 nanometer. So I hope you still uh, is with me. So again, it's very important for us to know that the frequency and the wavelength, because as we go deeper to your spectrophotometer, we're not simply measuring the light. Okay? Hindi mo mini-measure kung gaano kaliwanag, or hindi natin goal is to measure the light itself. What we want to measure is the specific wavelength of light, a specific spectrum, a specific region. Okay? So, again, that is very important. Okay? So, your spectrophotometer is actually governed by your spectrophotometry. Again, your spectrophotometry, why is it is very important? Because in absorption spectroscopy, okay, in absorption spectroscopy, we are actually measuring qualitatively or quantitatively different analytes in your body, and we can actually measure that through two measurement. We have your photometric measurement and your spectrophotometric measurement. And this is now where I will draw the line. Okay? So when we are talking about photometric measurement, we are measuring the light intensity without consideration of the wavelength. So be it in the visible region, in the infrared region, or in the ultraviolet region, we don't care. What we are measuring is the light intensity only. Are we clear? So in photometric, we're not talking about the spectrum, or we're not trying to dissect the light to its region from visible to ultraviolet and to infrared. Unlike your spectrophotometric measurement, we are measuring the light intensity in a narrower wavelength. And now here comes again your spectrum of light. Okay? Here comes now your spectrum of light. And this is your spectrum of light again. Okay? Your electromagnetic spectrum. So you have here your visible light, you have here your infrared, and your ultraviolet light. And that's what's make your spectrophotometer, your spectrophotometer different from your photometric measurement, because when we are talking about your spectrophotometric measurement, we are talking about a narrower wavelength. We are pertaining to a narrower wavelength. So take for example, in measuring a particular in measuring a particular analyte, what we want to use technically is only the infrared region, or maybe the ultraviolet region, or maybe the visible spectrum or the visible region, but not the general light or not the light in itself. Okay, are we clear? So that is for your analytical technique, which lead us now to your spectrophotometric measurement, because that is what the general principle of your spectrophotometer. So before I move on, let us again try to review your Beer's law. Okay? Yes, your Beer's law. Let's have a cheers. Okay? So your Beer's law states that the concentration of a substance is directly proportional to the light absorbed or inversely proportional to the logarithm of the transmitted light. Again, what we want to measure is the concentration of your analyte. And you're only able to do that by measuring the absorbance. Okay? The absorbance. And eventually, as we go through your spectrophotometer later on, we will be discussing the different components, and eventually I hope that you will be able to tie up the importance of your visible region, your infrared region, and your ultraviolet region when we go to your different components. Okay? So for now, let's review some key concepts. So again, your electromagnetic radiation, this is what we are actually measuring. Technically, this is your light, the light that we are measuring. So again, according to Planck's law, your energy is inversely proportional to your wavelength. Okay? It is inversely proportional to your wavelength. So meaning the higher the energy, the shorter, the higher the energy, the shorter the wavelength. The lower the energy, the longer the wavelength. On the other hand, frequency and wavelength, we also differentiated the two. And again, we are all about spectrophotometric measurement. Again, we are measuring the light intensity with concern to a narrower, um, a narrower, a narrower wavelength. And of course, again, for your visible, your ultraviolet, and your infrared light. So again, for your visible light, that is from 400 nanometer to 700 nanometer. Your ultraviolet light is from your ultraviolet light. On the other hand, when we are talking about your ultraviolet light, we are talking about less than 400 nanometer, and when we are talking about your infrared region, we are talking about greater than 700 nanometer. Okay, so that is it for now. So later on, I will also be um, giving you now the different components of your spectrophotometer, and this is now where we will be diving in to your machine, to your instrument, your spectrophotometer. But for now, that would be all, and I will be seeing you on our next video. So please, I will be leaving the link for your Beer's Law down below, so please check it out for more information. So for now, goodbye and have a great day.